That's the nicest introduction that Eddie's given to me in a long time. I heard about what he said last evening. He wondered what I was going to say. And if you intended to follow along the book, let me set the record straight now that I don't intend to follow it at all. So you'll need the tape as well as the book to get the double dose, I suppose. Sometimes when I'm introduced at places, some people get a little humor out of my height or something of a similar nature, which you can't see around the waist because I'm behind this pulpit stand. I feel every once in a while like Rodney Dangerfield. He said, he doesn't get any respect. He said, I called suicide prevention once and they put me on hold. My task today is not an enviable one by any stretch of the imagination. I really must take a very, very complex and difficult subject and appear to make it easy. Now, I assure you it isn't. But I'm going to try, in the time that's allotted to me, to acquaint you a bit with the background that has brought us to where we are today and why we are where we are. Some of the things that are being said, consequences that flow from the problem of secular humanism. I want to respond to secular humanism on their own battleground. And then as time permits, I want to help you see some of the principles that we use in Christian ethics. Specifically, I want to help unfold the nature of love as it is found in Scripture and as it formulates itself into an absolute moral principle for Christians. This is not an easy task. But if you'll bear with me and watch the charts carefully and listen to some of the big words that are being used, that people love to use to confuse others, I suppose, then perhaps you and I will be in tune as we proceed. Throughout much of its history, the United States of America has claimed and really assumed to be a religious nation, and indeed a good deal of time a Christian nation. God has been invoked with great regularity by public officials and by politicians who are espousing to become public officials on our coinage and in 1,000 other ways. If much of this religiosity has been superficial and most of the time, I suppose, hypocritical, nevertheless, it has expressed the aspirations of hundreds of thousands of Americans for the last 200 years. Now, this religiosity and the strength of the same reached its peak just prior to the 1960s. Quasi-official public ideology in the 1950s regarded religious belief and religious worship as self-evidently good things. People were urged to go to church services with very little regard for which church or for why one ought to do so. To be thought a non-believer or to be an open advocate of unbelief at that time was damaging to one's political career or any kind of public office that he might want to hold. The major organs of communication, like the media and the loose publications, supported religion, the public schools did too, as essential to the well-being of the nation. And there also existed during this time a fairly broad and general Judeo-Christian moral consensus, which simply means that people thought that the Judeo-Christian ethic was the right standard. Now, they may not have lived according to that standard. They might have lied, but they believed that lying was wrong. They may have been adulterers, but they believed adultery was wrong. They may have been drunkards, but they believed that that activity was wrong. To cite one particularly easily understood example, our nation at that time was overwhelmingly family-oriented. Particularly was this the case since men had come back from the Second World War and that particular conflict, which had separated families for so long a period. And now it was time to begin a new life, to begin families. And as a result, for several decades following the Second World War, family time and family orientation was at a peak in our country. And divorce was, as well as homosexuality and unmarried cohabitation, merely unthought of, unheard of, unspeakable. People may have practiced those things, but very rare was the brave soul who dared to defend it in public. During the past 20 years, especially during the 1960s, there has occurred a radical shattering of this broad moral consensus which formerly existed. Probably not at any other time during the 200 years of our history has there been such a radical and quick change in our ideological pattern of belief. As a result of this change, we are left with a society with practically no moral consensus on anything. Really no consensus on things outside of the realm of morality, but that's my subject today, morality. A huge spiritual vacuum was created. And this spiritual vacuum needed to be filled by something, and it is into this kind of a world that secular humanism took root. In the 1933 edition of Humanist Manifesto 1, they themselves proclaimed it to be a radical document. It was ahead of its time. It wasn't accepted by the mainstream of American thinking. But in 1973, they tried it again. And in 1981, they tried it again with the Secular Humanist Declaration. And now they are expressing, by the way, the ideas, beliefs, and practices of multiplied millions of people in our country as a result of having taken such swift root in the late 60s. While the call for pluralism, and this call for pluralism is being heard on every hand today, you've heard it, perhaps even defended pluralism and the pluralistic society in which we live. While pluralism seems to be merely a call for tolerance, it's a call for tolerance so as to allow the ruling orthodox pattern of belief to make room for newer points of view and other points of view. We are told that that's precisely how a democratic society should order itself. In point of fact, an orthodoxy which loses its authority finds it very difficult to retain even toleration. And as a matter of fact, though Christianity, which has been the ruling orthodoxy but is so no longer, is still extended bare legal toleration, in practice it finds itself more and more on the defense. Its very right to exist being challenged in any number of ways. The most obvious instance of this, I suppose, is the mass media. Here, the reigning pieties of a couple of decades ago, religion, capitalism, patriotism, the family, purity in sex, and purity in the sex life, and so on, find themselves subject to relentless attack. News coverage emphasizes in an obsessive way the problems associated with every one of these traditional institutions. They are habitually represented as dying, and dying because they are rigid, sclerotic, atavistic, unwilling to change. Their only hope for survival, we're told, is if they change beyond any recognition of what they were. So we're told the family will exist so long as we redefine family. Now we have to mean by family, so that we can retain the term family and allow it to exist, any persons who live together in the same dwelling place. That's the new definition of family. In those areas of the media which purport to be merely entertainment, the powerful weapon of ridicule is consistently employed. Such people as those who would affirm traditional values or religious values are regularly ridiculed, and they are routinely depicted as insecure, stupid, neurotic, and ridiculous. In television fiction, for example, religion is often shown as a deforming influence, rarely as positive and supportive as an element in one's life. We have our Archie Bunkers, you know, we have our Mauds, and we have 1,000 others who are made to appear as nothing other than stumbling, bumbling buffoons. And religious believers are portrayed as either fanatics or hypocrites. And so while we're busily laughing at ourselves as we're portrayed in the entertainment, we're really helping to undermine the very traditional values we have come here this week to espouse. Secularism has also chosen to assault Christianity at the point of sexual ethics because it believes that Christianity is most vulnerable at that point. A spirit of hedonism which has arisen in American society. I'd intended to bring a quotation of Hugh Hefner down and read it to you to show you that he considers himself to be a secular humanist. I was unable to locate it, but you might as well know that that's exactly what he is. This spirit has arisen in America, perhaps because of 35 years of continually rising prosperity, but whatever the reason, people now believe they have a right to the fulfillment of every personal desire and to scratch every single itch they might have. After all, in Collinsville, it was just that issue at stake, the right of privacy. A woman who was an admitted fornicator won in the courts of our nation because her rights to privacy were violated. Any kind of moral rule, especially one cast in the framework of thou shalt not, is treated as an intolerable interference with personal liberty. And shrewd secularists have calculated that the maximum amount of resentment can be aroused against Christianity just at this point. Now that's where we've come from, and that's where we're at today. If one denies God and denies an absolute moral standard rooted in the character and nature and word of God, then one is committed to ethics which are man-made. Now you can take your pick. You can have the group or you can have the individual. We'll talk about both of those in a few moments. As to how you're going to ground your standard, you can either ground it in a group consensus or individual beliefs, desires, wishes, or feelings. But secular humanists are clearly ethical relativists. I'll take time to explain that term in a few moments, but I want you to understand it as I read some of the writings of the men themselves. For example, Paul Kurtz, called the most aggressive humanist in our country, co-author of Humanist Manifesto 2, the author of Secular Humanist Declaration, former editor of the Humanist Magazine, now editor of Free Inquirer, a skeptical journal, says, as secular humanists, we believe in the central importance of the value of human happiness here and now. We are opposed to absolutist morality, the kind that you and I believe in. Frederick Edwards, the corresponding secretary for the American Humanist Association, editor of a journal called Creation Evolution, devoted to the destruction of creationist dogma, says, we base our ethical decisions and ideals upon human needs and concerns, as opposed to the alleged needs and concerns of supposed deities or other transcendent entities or powers. Another well-known secular humanist who has written a book called The Philosophy of Humanism espouses himself as a cultural relativist, says, for humanism, no human acts are good or bad in and of themselves. Whether an act is good or bad is determined by its consequences for the individual and the society. Humanist ethics draws its guiding principles from human experience and tests them in human experience. Still one more. Joseph Fletcher. You were introduced to him just a couple of nights ago by Brother Thompson. Very popular and influential secular humanist today who has abandoned any connection with religion altogether. Argues not for cultural relativism, but for contextual relativism, or situational relativism. He almost single-handedly, while he was still affiliated with religion, took on Christian ethics. His situation ethics virtually became a buzzword for any anti-Christian ethical system. We had a student here a couple of years ago, and there are dozens of anti-Christian ethical systems. Situation ethics is only one among many. But every time we mention something other than Christian ethics, he said, aha, situation ethics. From the words that we've been getting in our open forum and discussion throughout the week, I can see that the same confusion exists in the minds of some of you. But Fletcher was one who was on the minds and in the thoughts of thousands of preachers, many preachers of whom were vaguely familiar with the term situation ethics, and thousands of sermons devoted to its demise. But Fletcher insisted, though, that love, the law of love, demanded a situational rather than an absolutist ethic. Here's an example of his reasoning. It all depends on the situation. In some situations, unmarried love could be infinitely more moral than married-on love. Lying could be more Christian than telling the truth. Stealing could be better than respecting private property. No action is good or right in itself. It depends on whether it hurts or helps people, whether or not it serves love's purpose, understanding love to be personal concern in the situation. It's not difficult, then, to determine what position is occupied by atheistic humanists. If we understand what ethical absolutism is, the ethics of God, the ethics of Christianity, and we understand that ethical relativism denies everything Christian ethics stands for, we begin to see the issue at stake between those people and ourselves. According to the absolutists, there is but one eternally true and valid moral code. This moral code applies with rigid impartiality to all men. What is a duty for you must likewise be a duty for me. And this will be true whether you're an Englishman, a Chinaman, or a Hottentot. If cannibalism is an abomination in America, in England, it is likewise an abomination in Central Africa, notwithstanding the fact that the African doesn't think so. There is but one law, one standard, one morality for all men. And this standard, this law, is absolute and unvarying. That's absolutism. By the way, that's Christian ethics too. Relativism, on the other hand, is a position which denies that there is a single moral standard equally applicable to all men at all times. There is not, the relativist tells us, merely one moral law, one code, one standard. There are many moral laws, moral codes, and moral standards. What morality ordains in one place or time may be quite different from what morality ordains in another place or age. The moral code of Chinamen is quite different from that of Europeans. And that of African savages is quite different from both. I've even heard preachers of the gospel argue that if you didn't drink wine along with the Italians in Italy, you really couldn't do mission work there. They believe it's right. We believe it's wrong in America. It'd be right for us to do it there, wrong for us to do it here. That's relativism. And that is as anti-biblical as anything on the face of this earth. I clipped something a couple of years ago I thought you might enjoy. It's done in poetic form, but it really was designed to set forth what ethical relativism is. It goes like this. It all depends on where you are. It all depends on what you are. It all depends on what you feel. It all depends on how you feel. It all depends on how you're raised. It all depends on what is praised. What's right today is wrong tomorrow. Joy in France, in England sorrow. It all depends on point of view, Australia or Timbuktu. In Rome, do as the Romans do. If taste just happen to agree, then you have morality. But where there are conflicting trends, it all depends. It all depends. That, in a nutshell, is ethical relativism. By the use of some charts, I want to show you the basic difference between ethical relativism and ethical absolutism, if we can do that now, Ron, for just a few moments. In a very simplistic way, I've tried to show you what the difference is. There are two extremes in ethical reasoning. Absolutism maintains that there are absolute truths and absolute moral truths to which all human beings must adhere if they are to be moral. It doesn't tell us how we come to know those things just yet. It just simply says they are. Relativism maintains that there are no absolutes of any kind, but that everything, especially morality, is relative to particular cultures, groups, or even individuals. If we can look at the next chart now, Ron, I want to try to diagram this for you in three separate charts. First is ethical absolutism. As I've tried to show, it's rooted in the nature and character of God. Absolute objective moral standard means unchanging. It does not depend on persons or places or times for its validity. It's the same in all ages. And man A, man B, man C, man D are all bound to and obligated by that absolute objective moral standard. Every morally relevant situation is a unique ethical situation. That's not situation ethics. Every unique ethical situation calls for an application of absolute objective moral principles to that particular question. Now that's ethical absolutism. The next chart is called cultural relativism. There are a lot of different ways to point out group consensus relativism. You could believe in the law of the land as being your determinant for morality. Some people do. You could practice what I call Gallup poll morality, or the 51% ethic. That is, simply take polls and determine what people believe, and that's what your ethical standard is. Or you could call it a cultural relativism. That is, whatever a culture believes and thinks. And then man A, B, and C are presumably obligated to do what that culture believes to be right and avoid doing what that culture believes to be wrong. But since America is a particular culture and there are certain things we believe to be right which are not shared with France and are not shared with Germany and are not shared with Australia, then you see it would be relative to the geographical location or relative to the place you live. Abortion could be dictated to be right in America, but wrong in Australia. And you would have to say, if I lived in Australia, I'd have to fight it. If I lived in America, I could affirm it as moral. Now that's group consensus relativism, cultural relativism. Now there are another group of ethical relativist theories called subjective theories. These depend on what people believe, what people wish or desire. That's values clarification. Whatever I desire or wish to be right is right for me. And this doesn't depend on what the group thinks at all. It depends only on what I believe, what I want, what I desire. Situation ethics I've tried to illustrate here. Now Fletcher has changed from the loving thing to do, now that he's a humanist, to the needful thing to do. But it matters not. In each given situation, you apply situational standard A, and that obligates man A to do that thing, the loving thing to do. However he interprets the loving thing to do in that situation is what he is obligated to do. But the very next day, he may be obligated to do exactly the opposite, you see. And that obligation would differ for each person and for each situation. Now that's relative subjectivism. And that's even worse than the cultural relativist view. It's even more subjective, of course. Let me try to share with you some of the consequences of this position. Turn that off for just a moment, please, Ron. One author, a professor of philosophy at Princeton University for many years, explained that the growth of relativism came about because of skeptical religious beliefs. He says, now that we live in an age of widespread religious skepticism, whatever support was given to absolutist morality, which was found in Christianity, is withdrawn. The more skeptical men become, the more men begin disbelieving the inspiration and authority of the Bible, for example. The more secular humanism begins to make its rise and its views known, the less will people subscribe to absolute morality. That's all he's saying, and in that he's right. Now, what consequences do we draw from this? Well, humanists themselves know what consequences to draw from it. Let me give you an example. Once God has ceased to exist, one of them writes, once God has ceased to exist in human experience as the omnipotent and numinous Lord, there perishes with him every moral imperative addressed to man from beyond, and humanity ceases to be imprisoned by an obedience to an external will or authority. In other words, if God does not exist, there are no real moral obligations, except that which might somehow be located in man himself. Let me give you one more statement from Joseph Fletcher. He's one particular friend of mine. And he says, we tried to get him to a seminar. I wasn't involved in inviting him, but a seminar over in Dallas in February, in which many atheists and theists are going to come head-to-head in a conference, February 7th through the 10th. Paul Kurtz will be there. So will Wallace Matson, Anthony Flew, Albert Ellis, a number of other world-renowned atheists. But Fletcher says the autonomy of ethics in its interdependence of religious ideas is now generally recognized, even in religious circles. And he says, although there's no way to know whether God is dead, as some theologians have portrayed it, it is definite in any case that God is dead in ethics. And Joseph Fletcher is one of the most influential men in ethics today. What kind of consequences flow from this view? I have several listed in the book. Most of the ones I'm going to show you now are not going to be found as consequences are not going to be found in the book. I've given you some extra ones. But I want to show you how this affects you and me on the street, where we live. Let's look at a blown-up page from the book. That's the only thing I reproduced from the book here. These consequences on the street. Since the secularist ethic has taken our country by storm, it should not be surprising to find ethical relativism espoused by the average man on the street. As an example of this ethic, I want you to consider the advice to the Lovelorn column by Susan Dietz, who writes in the Forward Star Telegram. A young lady wrote to her and she said, "We're being pressured always to engage in sex. I'm a Christian or a religious person," she says, "and I don't want to do this kind of thing. What should I do? How should I react?" Dietz's advice was this: each single person must decide his or her own code of sexual behavior, based solely on what leads to personal comfort and peace. Outside pressures, like the church, like the Bible, like the elders, like the preachers of the gospel, like parents, must be resisted at all costs, particularly in this area of life. Inner morality is the final word. The Humanist Manifesto 2 says, and I quote, "Short of harming themselves or coercing others to do likewise, human beings should be free to pursue their sexual proclivities as they wish." That's exactly what Miss Dietz has said. She goes on a little further in the same column to another person, a perplexed divorcee who had begun to date again. And the divorcee says, "I feel like a used person, unworthy of a relationship with anyone, much less marriage." She continues, "Being a single woman today is like bouncing back and forth between the yes, yes of a cosmopolite and the no, no of a sermon." Dietz responds, "Forget the magazines and the sermons. They are there for reminders of our alternatives, but the final choice is within each of us. The only way to stop bouncing is to listen to your inner voice, that small friend, the conscience. We bring into our daily living and live by it. It is never wrong. Do only what keeps you calm and liking yourself." That's ethical subjectivism. You see, her advice was to reject any objective standard with reference to moral decision-making. No such moral standard at all. Next chart, please. The advice given to a lady known as Hurting by Dear Abby, and I wrote to Charles about this, by the way, Dub. This appeared in your bulletin. Charles couldn't get me the original article on this. I asked for it. But her advice was, do whatever affords you the most pleasure and the least pain. And just how did Hurting describe herself and her problem? 30 years of age, she lived with her boyfriend. Her parents stopped inviting him into her home when they learned of the living arrangements. She couldn't understand why her boyfriend should not be included in the family gatherings, just as her sister's husband. To complicate the problem in her mind was the fact that her boyfriend's parents received her warmly into their home. Her letter ended by saying, "I'm torn. Should I stay away until the man I love is welcome or go alone with a heavy heart?" Dear Abby suggested, "Your experience is another example of the widespread culture gap that separates generations today. Your parents view your lifestyle as a violation of tradition, morality, and the laws they live by. You view it as the right of a grown woman to make her own decisions." And then she concluded, "Do whatever affords you the most pleasure and the least pain." Another one, please. Miss Levichek appeared on the Phil Donahue show that some of you had seen with our brethren, Garland Elkins and some others, in the Collinsville trial. Now, she wasn't a member of the church, but her testimony or her story was interesting. She was there to lend support to Mary and Gwynn. Now, her minister had refused to perform a marriage between herself and the man she was living with because she had posed in Playboy magazine. She had admitted to living with this man for some time and openly fornicating with him on a repeated basis. She said, "I am a Christian and I read the Bible daily." And she said, and I think these are interesting, "I feel in my heart that Jesus wouldn't sit in judgment of me for doing this. I still am a Christian. I believe that Jesus taught love and honesty." You see, men today are taught to believe they can reconcile that kind of practice with biblical teaching. And she had come to try to reconcile the two as well. My favorite's the next one. I found this just before the election. I think you'll find this clear too. You'll remember Geraldine Ferraro said she was against abortion but pro-choice. And the question was asked, what if Geraldine Ferraro had been Abraham Lincoln's speechwriter? She would say something like, "Personally, I'm against slavery, but hey, if you want to own one, that's your business." Well, anyone that can't see the inconsistency in that ethical position is going to have special help. That just isn't rational. And yet that, ladies and gentlemen, I've called these from popular magazines, from 17 magazine, from the Forward Star Telegram, from Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, from all sorts of readily accessible documents that hit our doorsteps every day. They're calling upon you and me to accept something less than Christian ethics. How shall we respond to all of this? You want to turn that off for just a moment, please, Ron? How shall we respond to all of this? Well, you say, let's quote the Bible to them. After all, isn't that where God's ethic is recorded? Yes. It's also recorded in the world because God's character is imprinted upon the world too. But isn't it more perfectly expressed in the Word? Oh, yes. Then let's quote the Bible to them. The humanist says, now wait a minute. I don't believe in God, let alone something you purport to be His Word. You're going to have to answer me on some other ground than that. I don't think you can quote the Bible to me and be very successful. He's got a point. He doesn't accept it as authority. For you and for me, that's fine. For him, it's not so good. Then are we left with no answer? Of course not. We fight the battle on his battleground. We fight the battle on reason alone. I labor under the opinion and the impression that if I can defeat a position through reason alone, then how much stronger is my position when I add to reason God's inspired and infallible revelation? Put the two together, you've got an unbeatable case. And there's no way that their position can stand on the basis of reason alone. Let me show you why. I've developed 12 arguments in the essay. Please read it. But I just wanted to give you a couple of the ones that we're using. For example, a relativist, when he asserts that the moral standards of particular social groups are the only standards that exist, he renders meaningless any attempt to compare these standards with one another. For example, let me advance the proposition. The attempted extermination of the Jews by the Nazis is a behavior that is always wrong for all persons, in all places, in all periods of human history. That's my proposition. Now, how could one justify this proposition in the absence of an ultimate or absolute standard? Well, of course, you couldn't. So the ethical relativist, when he tries to justify this proposition, finds he cannot do so consistently. Now the question is, do these propositions have any meaning? Well, we habitually assume they do. When one says, this is better than that, we know he's comparing these two things with something other than that as a yardstick. If I say, I am getting better, and the standard is over there at the end of the step, I am getting better, that means I'm approximating the standard ever so much more closely. If you say I'm getting worse, I'm degrading, I'm going backwards, then you know I'm traveling farther away from the standard of correct behavior. Well, that's not all that difficult to understand. But without that standard being there, there's no way to say that this behavior is better than that. You couldn't speak about virtue and vice. You couldn't speak about generosity and the lack of the same. You couldn't speak about cowardice and courage. There would be no way at all on earth to understand what those terms mean. Because each of them implies a third thing to which they are compared, which tells you that this is really courage and this is really cowardice. This is really good and this is really evil. I was talking with a young cultural relativist one day, and she told me, I asked her, is it wrong and was it wrong for Adolf Hitler to do what he did and the Nazis do what they did in the Second World War? She said, oh, sure. I said, how do you know? She said, well, it's socially unacceptable behavior. Now, she claimed to be a cultural relativist. She had studied sociology. I said, it is? She said, yes. I said, why? She said, well, that's just not right. I said, why? She denied that God existed, that the Bible was His Word. I said, isn't it true that in that particular culture, since you're a cultural relativist, that the Germans were doing what German law dictated for them to do? Given your own theory, they were obligated to murder Jews. But you say that's socially unacceptable. Why? She never had an answer. She finally said, I'll just simply yield for the time being. There isn't any answer to that, and any fool can see it. Anthony Flew was forced to admit that he would have had to die rather than join the Germans in exterminating Jews. How many minutes? 3 minutes. I think I'll follow the lead of Johnny Ramsey and Gary Workman and Dub McClish and some others who have extended the time just a bit beyond propriety and go beyond my 3 minutes. No, he says I won't. Well, all right. The notion that a Well, I'll have to skip through some of these things, then, won't I? Let me give you another argument that I think will help you for just a moment. All reformers must of necessity be immoral, given ethical relativist positions. Why is that the case? Because the moral standards that exist in the society are precisely what they're trying to change. So when they come along the scene and try to change it, they say, no, this isn't right. Well, this is what we believe. All the time they're trying to change that standard, they must be wrong. They must be immoral. Now, should they succeed, and they rarely do, then we've got to defend their actions now as moral, because you see, the society has changed and now believes the same thing the Reformer taught. Now, understand what I'm saying. Jesus, the Son of God, has to be, given ethical relativism, declared to be an immoral man, because he came into Jewish society to reform those people for their immoral behavior. But now we've got to defend him as a moral man because he succeeded. If you cannot see the absurdity of that, well, you can. I don't have to insult your intelligence. I know you're intelligent. You can see how absurd that is. To argue consistently for ethical relativism is not only impossible, too, it's self-contradictory. According to relativism, a person can be both immoral and immoral, moral and immoral, while performing the same act at about the same time. For instance, in Dallas County, one could say abortion is legal and morally right. In Tarrant County, one could say abortion is immoral and wrong. Now, the act of abortion itself is what we're focusing upon, you see. If it differs from place to place and time to time and area to area and from person to person, then it could very well be wrong here and right there, or vice versa. But abortion cannot both be right and wrong. It's either right or wrong, and it can't be both. The truth of the matter is, abortion as unjustified murder of innocent human beings is wrong under any and all circumstances, save a tubal pregnancy where the baby cannot come to term at all. It can't be both. Now, ethical relativism implies it can be both, but it can't. Therefore, ethical relativism is false. It really doesn't take an expert in reasoning to figure that out. Now, if relativism is false, and it is, the only other alternative is ethical absolutism. And if ethical absolutism is true, and it is, then there must be an absolute being in which all these moral qualities like mercy and justice and love, and goodness, compassion, sympathy, empathy, exist to the superlative degree, and there is, that being is God. Since I've got very little time left, I want to tell you a very brief story. Many, many years ago in ancient Greece, and you recall it well, the ancient city of Troy was laid under siege. For many, many years, the Greeks tried to assault that city directly, and they could not succeed. The city was too strong. Just like America, if a direct assault had been taken against America, the humanists would not have succeeded because the vast majority of the common man still believes in morality, and so they would have fought them off. But the Greeks came up with a very ingenious idea. We will, in a very subtle way, infiltrate the city. Now, at stake was the city. Each, the Greeks and the Trojans, trying to set their flag of victory over the city as the spoil. The Trojans succeeded, took the city, and were then on the inside, and now the Greeks have the obligation of trying, or the job of trying to infiltrate or to storm the city. In the last few years, the Trojan horse of secular humanism has been rolled to the door and has been brought through the door and has infiltrated the city. And now we find ourselves where once we were safe and secure within the walls, now on the outside of the walls, being placed in the position ourselves of having to infiltrate where we were once defeated. You have a hard time believing that inside this building with the doors closed to the outside world, but you don't have to step very far from this building to find out that what I'm telling you is the truth. And may God help us. Though we be few, and though we be perhaps not as strong a voice as we need to be now, may God help us to have the courage to infiltrate the city. And may we do it the only way it can be done when we talk about Christian ethics, by means of righteous living, righteous propagation of the truth, in righteous defense of the same. I commend you to the task.